A father looked his son in the eye on a Saturday afternoon in June 1975 and told him he was dead to him. Not in private, in the middle of his own showroom in Blue Earth, Minnesota, with customers drinking coffee by the parts counter and kids running between the tractors. Richard Hollister's voice bounced off the polished concrete. "You want to throw away everything I've built? Everything my father built? To play mechanic with some dirt farmer and his junkyard tractors?" Everyone heard it. Public disowning has a specific purpose. It's not just rejection, it's a performance. When you exile someone in front of witnesses, you're burning the bridge so thoroughly that coming back becomes nearly impossible. Richard understood power, and he was using every ounce of it. David Hollister was 22 years old, standing near the door with a duffel bag over his shoulder and grease still visible under his fingernails. He didn't raise his voice. "It's not about throwing anything away, Dad. It's about learning something real." That calmness in the face of rage, that tells you something about who had already won this argument internally. Richard laughed, the kind of harsh sound that comes from a man who mistakes volume for authority. "Real? This dealership does $2 million a year. $2 million. And you're walking out to go work for a man who can't afford to buy a new set of tires." David's response was simple. Walt Erickson has forgotten more about engines than anyone in this showroom will ever know. Think about that exchange for a moment. Two completely different definitions of expertise. Richard measured knowledge in revenue. David measured it in capability. One man defined success by what you could sell. The other defined it by what you could do with your own hands. This wasn't just a father-son argument. It was a collision between two incompatible philosophies about what makes a person valuable in this world. Richard's next line was calculated cruelty. Walt Erickson is a 68-year-old failure who farms 160 acres with equipment from the 1940s. He's a joke, David, and now you're going to be a joke too. That word, failure. Richard used it like a weapon because by every metric he understood, Walt was a failure. Small acreage, old equipment, no expansion, no growth, no empire. Just a man who'd farmed the same marginal land for 40 years without owing anybody a single dollar. Richard saw poverty. David saw something else entirely. "I'm sorry you see it that way," David said. And that's when Richard delivered the final blow. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. I mean it. You won't be my son anymore. You'll be nothing." David nodded once. Then he walked out. Behind him, his mother cried. His father shouted something else about ungrateful children and wasted opportunities. The customers whispered. By nightfall, everyone in Faribault County would know that the Hollister boy had thrown away a $2 million business to work for a broke old farmer nobody respected. David didn't look back. That detail matters. Not looking back isn't cinematic, it's tactical. When you're walking away from your entire identity, from every assumption about who you're supposed to be, you can't afford to hesitate. Doubt is contagious. Second-guessing spreads like rot. David understood that if he turned around, if he let himself feel the full weight of what he was losing, he might not make it through that door. Here's what led to that moment. David was born in 1953, the only child of Richard and Dorothy Hollister. From the day he could walk, everyone assumed he'd take over the dealership. It wasn't discussed. It was simply understood, the way gravity is understood. Richard made sure of it. Every summer from age 12 onward, David worked at Hollister Implement. He swept floors, stocked shelves, learned to write sales orders, helped in the parts department. By the time he graduated high school, he knew the business from top to bottom. He was competent, reliable, good at everything he tried. But here's the thing nobody wanted to acknowledge. He didn't love it. Richard sent him to college for 2 years. Business courses, accounting, marketing. David came back and worked full-time at the dealership, wearing a tie, learning to shake hands with bankers and smooth-talk customers. He was good at it. Really good, but every single day felt like wearing someone else's clothes. The dealership sold new equipment, brand new John Deeres, straight from the factory with warranties and financing plans and shiny green paint. Farmers would come in, sign the papers, drive away on tractors that cost more than most houses. When those tractors broke down, which they rarely did at first, The dealership service department would fix them quickly, efficiently, expensively. David understood the business model perfectly. He just didn't believe in it. He'd noticed something his father either couldn't see or chose not to see. The farmers who bought new equipment every few years, who always had the latest model, who financed everything through the dealership, those farmers were always stressed, always worried about payments, interest rates, whether next year's crop would cover this year's debt. But the farmers who kept their old equipment running, the ones who drove 30-year-old tractors and fixed them themselves, those farmers slept well at night. They didn't owe anyone anything. They weren't trapped. This is where most people get leverage wrong. They think leverage means borrowing money to make money, but leverage cuts both ways. Yes, you can use debt to expand. You can also use debt to build a cage around yourself where every decision is dictated by payment schedules and interest rates. David saw farmers who technically owned more, but actually controlled less. Their banks owned them. Their equipment dealers owned them. The whole system was designed to keep them on a treadmill, always needing the next upgrade, always one bad season away from collapse. David started asking questions. He talked to the old-timers who came into the dealership, not to buy, just to look around, maybe pick up a part. He'd ask them how they kept ancient machines running, what they'd learned over the decades, what they knew that the younger generation had forgotten. That's how he met Walt Erickson. And without Walt, none of this happens. Walter Erickson was 68 years old in 1975. He farmed 160 acres of marginal land about 12 miles outside Blue Earth, land his father had homesteaded in 1903. He'd never married, never had children, never done much of anything except work his fields and keep his equipment running. His equipment was legendary in the county, but not in a good way. He drove a 1947 Farmall M that he'd bought new 28 years earlier. He had a 1952 Farmall Super C for lighter work. His combine was a 1958 Massey Harris that made sounds no machine should make, but somehow kept harvesting. Most people thought Walt was crazy or stubborn, or just too poor to buy anything newer. They'd see him driving that old Farmall down the county road, smoke puffing from the stack, and they'd shake their heads. Richard Hollister called him the last dinosaur. But David saw something different. One afternoon in the spring of 1975, David was making a parts delivery to a farm near Walt's property when his truck broke down. He walked to the nearest place, which happened to be Walt's farm, to use the phone. He never made that phone call. What he found instead was a workshop unlike anything he'd ever seen. Walt had built it himself over 40 years. A long, low building with a dirt floor and wooden walls, and every tool imaginable, most of them older than David. Inside were 3 tractors in various states of disassembly, plus an engine on a stand, plus what looked like an entire transmission spread across a workbench. Walt was sitting on an overturned bucket, machining a part on an ancient lathe. "Mr. Erickson," David said from the doorway, "I'm David Hollister. My truck broke down on the road." "I know who you are," Walt said without looking up. "Richard's boy, the one who's going to take over the dealership." "Yes, sir. I was wondering if I could use your phone." "Phone's in the house. Help yourself." Walt kept working. The part he was making was small, precise, clearly requiring concentration. David should have gone to the house, called the dealership, had someone come pick him up. That's what he should have done. Instead, he asked, "What are you making?" Walt finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "Governor shaft for a Farmall H. Haven't been able to get one from the factory in 15 years, so I make them myself." "You make your own parts?" "Make them, modify them, adapt them from other machines. Whatever it takes." Walt went back to his work. "Your father would say I'm wasting my time. Says I should just buy a new tractor and stop living in the past." "What do you say?" Walt smiled, a thin, weathered smile. "I say a man who depends on someone else to fix his equipment is a man who doesn't really own anything. He just borrows it until it breaks." David stood in that doorway for a long moment, watching Walt work. The lathe hummed. Metal shavings curled away from the part. Outside, a meadowlark was singing, and something shifted in David's chest. Something he'd been feeling for years without being able to name it. "Could you teach me?" he asked. Walt stopped the lathe. He looked at David again, longer this time. Teach you what? Everything. How to make parts, how to keep old machines running, how to… David struggled to find the words. How to really understand how things work. Here's what Walt understood that most people don't. There's a difference between operating something and understanding it. You can drive a car without knowing how an engine works. You can use a computer without understanding code. Modern life is built on layers of abstraction that let us use complex systems without comprehending them. That's efficient, but it's also a form of dependency. When something breaks and you can't fix it yourself, you're at the mercy of whoever can. Walt had spent 50 years making sure he was never at anyone's mercy. Why? Walt asked. Why do you want to learn this? David thought about it. Because everything I know is about selling, about convincing people they need something new. But nobody at the dealership, including my father, actually knows how to fix anything. We just replace parts. We don't understand how the machines work. We're just middlemen. Walt studied him for another long moment. Then he said, come back tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Wear old clothes. That was it. No grand speeches, no promises, just an invitation. David showed up the next morning at 6, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. For 3 months, he worked at the dealership during the day and learned from Walt in the early mornings and evenings. Walt taught him how to read a machine, how to listen to an engine and know what was wrong, how to machine parts on the lathe, how to weld, how to adapt components from one tractor to work on another. He taught him how to read old manuals, how to source parts from salvage yards, how to keep equipment running decades past its supposed lifespan. But Walt taught him something more important than technical skills. He taught him a philosophy. This dealership your father runs, Walt said one evening as they rebuilt a carburetor. It's built on a simple idea. Sell people something new, then sell them something newer when that breaks down or goes out of style. Keep them buying, keep them financing, keep them dependent. That model works great for the dealer, works terrible for the farmer. So what's the alternative? Knowledge, Walt said simply. You teach a farmer how to maintain his own equipment, how to fix it himself, how to keep it running. You give him independence. He doesn't need you anymore. That's bad for business, but good for people. David understood immediately why his father would never accept this logic. Richard had built his entire identity on being needed, on being the man farmers had to come to, on controlling the supply chain of equipment and parts and service. The idea of making customers independent, of teaching them not to need you, that was economic suicide from Richard's perspective. But from David's perspective, it was the only thing that made moral sense. By August of 1975, David knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep wearing the tie and shaking hands and selling dependency while learning a completely different philosophy in his spare time. He had to choose. So he asked Walt, would you let me work for you full-time? Walt set down the wrench he was holding. Work for me. Teach me everything you know. Let me help you on the farm. I'll work for room and board if that's all you can afford. Walt was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, your father will never forgive you. I know. You'll lose everything. The business, the inheritance, probably your family. I know. And you're still willing to do it. I am. Walt nodded slowly. Then you're a better man than I thought. Come Monday. That's Saturday in June, David told his father. And Richard did exactly what David knew he would do. He rejected him completely, publicly, permanently. Or so he thought. 10 years passed. David lived on Walt's farm, became an expert at keeping old machinery running, at fabricating parts, at diagnosing problems by sound and feel. He went from being heir to a $2 million business to making maybe $8,000 a year. But he was learning things money couldn't buy. During those same 10 years, Hollister Implement kept running. Richard expanded, opened a satellite location, took on more debt, pushed harder for sales. He and Dorothy didn't speak to David. Not once. Dorothy wanted to. David found out later she tried many times, but Richard wouldn't allow it. The official family position was that David no longer existed. Walt died in the summer of 1983. He was 76 years old, heart attack while working on his combine. David found him in the workshop, the same place where they'd met 8 years earlier. Walt left everything to David: the farm, the equipment, the tools, the knowledge. In the will, Walt had written one line: "He understands what matters." David kept farming that 160 acres. He also started taking on side work, fixing equipment for other farmers who couldn't afford dealership prices or who had old machinery nobody else wanted to work on. Word spread. The kid who'd given up the Hollister fortune was apparently the best mechanic in the county. Then, in 1985, the farm crisis hit hard. You need to understand what this meant. Years of falling crop prices, high interest rates, and crushing debt all came due at the same time. Farmers who'd expanded in the boom years of the 1970s suddenly couldn't make their loan payments. Banks started foreclosing. Equipment dealers, including the ones who'd encouraged all that expansion and debt, went under. It was catastrophic. Hollister Implement got hit worse than most. Richard had overextended. The satellite location was bleeding money. The debt load was enormous. And suddenly, farmers stopped buying new equipment because they couldn't afford it or couldn't get financing. In the fall of 1985, Richard Hollister realized he was going to lose everything. The business, the building, probably his house. Everything 3 generations had built was about to vanish. He swallowed his pride and drove out to Walt's old farm. That's where David was living, working the same land, using the same old equipment. Richard knocked on the door. David answered. They looked at each other for the first time in 10 years. Richard looked older, grayer, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I need your help," Richard said. "That's all." No apology, no admission of fault, just a simple statement of need. David could have said no. He could have reminded his father of every word from that Saturday afternoon in 1975. Could have pointed out that Richard had called him nothing, had disowned him, had forbidden his own wife from speaking to their son. He could have enjoyed the sweet validation of being right. Instead, David said, "Come in. Tell me what's happening." Richard explained the situation. The debt, the falling sales, the looming foreclosure. He explained that he'd tried everything he could think of and nothing was working. The model that had worked for 40 years had stopped working, and he didn't know how to adapt. "What do I do?" Richard asked. And that question, that's the moment everything changed. Because it wasn't rhetorical, it wasn't sarcastic, it was genuine. Richard Hollister was asking his son for help, and he meant it. David thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "You need to change everything about how you do business." "What does that mean?" "Stop selling new equipment. Stop pushing debt. Stop making farmers dependent on you. Do the opposite." The opposite? Become what Walt was. Source used equipment, refurbish it, sell it at prices farmers can actually afford. Teach them how to maintain it themselves. Use the service bay for teaching maintenance classes. Use your parts inventory to keep old machines running instead of pushing new ones. Richard sat in silence for a long moment. Everything David was describing went against 40 years of his life, against his father's legacy, against everything he believed about business. But he was out of options, and his son was offering him the only life raft in sight. "Would you help me?" Richard asked. "Would you come back? Show me how to do this?" David looked at his father. 10 years of silence, 10 years of rejection. And now in his father's darkest moment, a chance to be a son again. But David understood leverage. He understood power dynamics. And he understood that if he came back on Richard's terms, nothing would really change. "I'll help you," David said, "but I'm not coming back to work for you. We'd be partners, equal partners, and we do things my way." Richard Hollister was not a man who shared control easily. He'd run his business alone for decades, made every decision himself, answered to no one. But that business was dying, and his son was offering to save it. "Partners," Richard said, "equal partners." They shook hands. It was the first time they'd touched in 10 years. The next 3 years were about transformation. Richard and David restructured everything. They canceled the John Deere franchise, converted the showroom into a used equipment depot, turned the service department into a teaching center. They kept the Hollister name but added, keeping farmers running since 1923. The first year was brutal. Old customers went elsewhere. The bank watched nervously. Richard sold his Cadillac and drove a 10-year-old pickup, admitting that his entire image was wrong. But slowly, things began to turn. The farmers who were surviving the crisis, the careful ones, the debt-free ones, the ones who knew how to work with their hands, started coming to Hollister. They bought refurbished equipment at prices they could afford. They took maintenance classes. They told their neighbors. By the end of 1986, Hollister Implement was breaking even. By 1987, profitable. By 1988, the most successful equipment business in Farmall County. And something else changed during those years. Richard and David started talking about the 10 years they'd lost, about what Richard had said and why, about what David had learned from Walt and why it mattered. Richard admitted he'd been wrong, not just about disowning David, about everything. "I spent my whole life selling new equipment," Richard said one evening, "making farmers think they needed the newest, the biggest, and all along the answer was the opposite." He looked at his son. "You were right to walk away. I was wrong to let you go." David was quiet for a moment. "You didn't let me go, Dad. You told me to go. There's a difference." "I know, and I've regretted it every day for 10 years. David reached over and put his hand on his father's shoulder. "But I'm here now. We're here now. That's what matters." Richard Hollister died in 1994 at the age of 73. By then, he'd spent 9 years working alongside his son, learning things he'd never thought to learn, building something more valuable than anything he'd built before. The business they created together is still running today. David's son, Richard's grandson, named Walter after the man who taught David everything, runs it now. They still sell refurbished equipment. They still teach maintenance classes. They still believe that independence is the only real security. And in the lobby of the shop, there's a framed photograph on the wall. It shows 3 men standing in front of an old Farmall M. Walt Erickson, David Hollister, and Richard Hollister. The photo was taken in 1987, 2 years after Richard swallowed his pride and asked his son for help. Underneath the photograph, there's a small plaque with words Walt used to say, "A man who depends on someone else to fix his equipment is a man who doesn't really own anything. He just borrows it until it breaks." Below that, added after Richard died, "A man who can't admit he was wrong doesn't really own his own life either. He just borrows it until the truth catches up." Here's what this story is really about. In 1975, Richard Hollister looked at his son and saw a failure. A boy who had rejected everything his family had built. A disgrace to the Hollister name. What he couldn't see, what it took him 10 years and a crisis to understand, was that David hadn't rejected anything worth keeping. He had simply recognized earlier than his father that the world was changing, that the old model of selling dependency was dying, that the farmers who would survive the coming storm were the ones who knew how to take care of themselves. David didn't walk away from his father's legacy. He walked toward a different kind of legacy, one built on knowledge instead of sales, on independence instead of dependency, on the quiet satisfaction of keeping old machines running instead of the flashy pride of selling new ones. And in the end, that legacy saved the very business his father thought he was destroying. That's the part most people miss. David wasn't rebelling. He was adapting. He saw the future more clearly than his father did, and he had the courage to act on that vision even when it cost him everything. So the next time someone tells you you're making a mistake, the next time someone says you're throwing away your future, disgracing your family, walking away from everything that matters, ask yourself this: are they seeing clearly, or are they just seeing what they've always seen, unable to imagine that the world might be different than they thought? David Hollister saw something his father couldn't see. It cost him 10 years of silence. It cost him his place in his family. It cost him everything he was supposed to inherit. But it also saved him, and eventually it saved his father too. Because sometimes the only way to honor a legacy is to let it go. And sometimes the only way to find your family is to leave them first. That Farmall M, the one David was working on the day his father disowned him, is still in the shop. David's grandson restored it a few years ago, the same way David once learned to restore old engines in Walt's barn. It runs as well now as it did in 1947. Some things, if you take care of them, last forever. And some relationships, if you give them enough time, find their way back. Even when it takes 10 years. Even when it takes a crisis. Even when everyone says it's impossible. Never bet against a man who knows how to fix things. He might just fix more than machines.